Hey everyone, and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. Out of all the WoW expansion betas that I remember, I think BFA might just be the most drama-laden, or at least it's fairly trading blows with Warlords of Draenor, which had the super fun topics of Karabor, Bladespire, and of course flying. But with BFA, we really just have seen a constant stream of drama, and I find this to be super interesting to dive into and explore. And I think that going into this and the wide range of slightly dramatic topics, it's actually revealed a lot about the expansion itself, and perhaps how it seems like Blizzard are even baiting the odd thing. First, Before the Storm came out 2 days ago, and you can get it for free over on Audible by following my link down in the description. The proceeds go straight into the game development work and that team, and Before the Storm itself, it's pretty much required reading to really get the first-person perspective of where the characters are coming from as we go into Battle for Azeroth. So today we'll be looking at how the BFA discussion has been, as one duo would call it, a little bit of a shit show. First up, we've got gameplay. There's going to be plenty of time for the lore, the world, and the characters later, but we got to cover gameplay, which is one of the aspects of this expansion that really has been under the microscope. And let's kick it off with the new baseline. So Legion was a big experiment in class design. Blizzard integrated the usual design changes that would come in a new expansion with the progression system of that expansion. So rather than capping and getting a new talent or maybe your Draenor perks, we instead got an array of artifact traits and legendaries in addition to what we would normally get. This experiment seems to have worked out from Blizzard's perspective, which means that they likely want this to be the model going forward for all future expansions. This means that the game's classes needed to be set up in such a way that they are built for external systems to modify them easily. Essentially, Blizzard have to establish a baseline gameplay for what every spec is that can then be tweaked. This has involved losing quite a lot of the shiny toys that we've grown used to over Legion, which does kind of sting hard because we've been used to, honestly, pretty absurd versions of some of our specs in terms of pace by the time 7.3's hit. Much of the feedback for BFA on beta as well is at level 110 with characters that don't have high-end Azeroth gear, which means that it's really just a commentary on the baseline version of a spec and not what you're going to be playing 6 months in. Basically, this has made it really hard for players to give good feedback for the end game of Battle for Azeroth gameplay, and that is what has people worried. Next, the global cooldown. Blizzard went into the GCD change guns blazing, implementing a massive wave of changes all at once. This shocked the balls off players. Many of the spells we were used to doing instantly, nope, they're now on the GCD, and that has had the effect of changing the combat feel. Then Blizzard put a bunch of defensives like disengage on the GCD, which has further worried people. There was parallels between WoW and FF14 that were drawn, people were spooked. Many thought that Blizzard were attempting to significantly slow down the pace of the gameplay, in addition to making specs a bit more simple at their baseline. This caused a whirlwind of fury amongst players. Many of the GCD changes have been reverted though, with the major offenders like Disengage, Bloodlust, and Trinkets. They're now off the GCD again as they were in Legion. The changes are not as large, but they still are pretty significant. For most people, it should only lead to maybe 1 or 2 extra GCDs per minute, with arguably the largest annoyance being maybe your high-end, your macros being a bit less useful. Blizzard seem to have found a slightly better VAT balance. It's not exactly what I would like them to be doing, if I'm completely honest, but yeah, this is certainly one of the reasons why there's been a lot more drama with this expansion than previous. Then next up, we've got Legion Holdovers. So as I said, Legion was an expansion of experimentation. Almost everything they tried to do had an upside, but it came with something that was kind of annoying with the implementation. So legendaries, they had so many cool effects, but the random acquisition was a bit of a drag. The same goes with artifact power, which was a bit awkward for people who played in multiple specs, but did seem to give progression, at least for the start of the expansion, was fun. We then have Titan Forging, which, yeah, we've already all got an opinion on. Seeing the shadows of these systems be reflected in BFA conjures up a negative image, and at the end of the day, if we're given a positive and a negative of equal magnitude, people will overemphasize the negative because that's how we're hardwired for survival. Now, the main thing with BFA is that it does improve on the downsides of many of these systems. Artifact power is pretty much shared between all specs because it powers up your necklace, not a spec-specific weapon. Azeroth gear, unlike Legion legendaries, drops from known sources, at a regular, just like a regular loot table like anything else, and it also doesn't Titanforge. And then as for Titanforging, Blizzard are reining it in, they're making it a bit weaker, they're making it a bit more rare. So there are still awkward aspects to a lot of these systems, like Azerite gear having to be reforged at a vendor if you want to swap specs, but overall what they seem to have done is kept most of the positive Legion aspects while dodging most of the egregious negatives. Next, modern WoW. As time goes on, the split between what I'm going to call modern WoW and old WoW, it's became more clear. The old version of WoW was not high-octane, tightly designed gameplay. It was about a long journey that you progressed on with your friends, and it had gameplay that was a little bit weak. Then modern WoW, well, it's far more gameplay-focused, and it has progression that has started to move away from the game's RPG roots, and has really become its own beast, with loot systems and all that being more defined by the needs of modern WoW than the expectations of the RPG genre. Now, I'm in the odd position of actually liking both of them for different reasons, but it's clear that some people are being left behind in the transition as the game tries to modernize and stay with the industry. Thankfully, WoW Classic is coming out at some point for the people who don't enjoy the current game, and it's certainly going to be interesting to see how that plays out, especially if it does well. Alright, that's the big gameplay bit covered. But let's talk about Azeroth, because, man, people care about Azeroth and its people. Many of us have spent a tremendous amount of time in Azeroth, multiple thousands of hours in many cases. Even, like, before World of Warcraft, there's the Warcraft RTSs, which have eaten up loads of our time. We've spent so much time in this world that it really feels like a place. I mean, come on, most of us can navigate like 300 square kilometers of terrain like the back of our hands. That's probably better than we can do with, like, the place that we live. Probably it's even more than 300 square kilometers. It's crazy. And all that time we've been engaging with the inhabitants of the world. Basically, WoW has worked its way really deep into our heads. We've got a big emotional engagement and a large sunk cost. So this acts as a big multiplier on everything that I'm really going to be covering, especially in this section about the lore and the world and the characters. So the Horde versus Alliance theme really is going back to basics. Vanilla World of Warcraft involved actually a narrative reset from Warcraft 3, where both factions kind of slipped back into fighting each other. From that base, Blizzard escalated the lore more and more as time went on. TBC was a bit messy, but Wrath was world-threatening, Cataclysm was even more world-threatening, MoP was an attempted reset, WoD was supposedly world-ending based on what they said about the initial strength of the Iron Horde, and then Legion literally ended with one of the most powerful beings ever stabbing our planet in a big heap of anime. So there's been an escalation of stakes from basic fantasy to full-blown crazy anime madness. What does this mean? Well, it means that depending on where players hopped onto the World of Warcraft train, we're all going to have different feels of what the Warcraft universe is. So when BFA comes along and it takes us all the way back to Alliance versus Horde, that theme being so front and center as well in Blizzard's marketing, that might not gel with some of the newer players who are used to something different. Then for the ancients among us, well, some of us will love going back to basics, but others will just see it as a regression. As for my thoughts on this theme, well, even if it's not the most immediately exciting direction to go in right now, I think it probably is necessary for carving out the future life of the game. Though, as I've said, I am in the camp of people who really do like the Alliance versus Horde theme. Alright, reason 2. Alliance versus Horde content. So BFA splits quite a lot of its world and content down the faction line. Of course, this opens up at max level, but the main storylines are kind of separate. Now, both continents have a very different look and feel. Kulturas has a fantastic feeling of being an actual place with an epic sense of scale, and it's wide open and it very much doesn't feel like the overly dense Legion zones, but tonally, you know what, it's quite varied. It's ranging from some properly dark villains to some more lighthearted stories that do a good job of fleshing out the people of the continent. Zandalar, by comparison, is very different. Nazmir and Zuldazar are a lot more dense and Legion-like, especially Zuldazar. Its tone overall probably is a bit darker, and its plotlines are more linear and directed, meaning that it's easier to follow. The story's perhaps better told, and it's maybe a little bit more exciting, but that's because Zandalar sets up Raid 1, while Kulturas sets up Raid 2, and there'll certainly be more story content, on top of the Kulturas stuff for Raid 2's launch. Basically, Zandalar demo's better, but Kulturas is the overall better designed zone, but with arguably worse questing. Zandalar demoing so well has sort of disproportionately made it look better, which I think has been a part of the ongoing Alliance versus Horde debate, where a lot of people think that the Horde really are getting better content, where I wouldn't necessarily agree. Alright, next up, a filler expansion. Is this a filler? I mean, it's a bit weird. Vanilla WoW wasn't filler, but, not much happened bar dealing with a bunch of random threats. Many people then thought that Mists of Pandaria, with its self-contained narrative and all of that, it kind of functioned as filler content. BFA, on the face of it, doesn't look like it massively moves the lore forward like Legion did, so there's a perception that BFA is a filler expansion. Now, I get where that perception comes from, but I would be extremely, extremely surprised if this ended up being a lore filler expansion, given all the dark stuff suggested with N'Zoth. Then further to this, WoW expansions used to not feel like filler because you would know the end villain in advance. This meant that you were setting off on a predefined journey. The problem with this is that back then, that's when WoW expansions were concerned with going through World of Warcraft's lore, not creating new lore. So it really is a new era, and I don't think the idea of this being a filler expansion is really that applicable. Next up, the characters. Characters are getting a little bit extreme in their actions, particularly Sylvanas with her Forsaken. Many players feel like they are following the Forsaken's orders, not the Horde's orders, and this has created a lot of rumbling from the Horde side of the player base. Why is that? Well, the core Horde values are not really reflected in the Forsaken, at least, not for the likes of, say, the Tauren. Then Sylvanas' portrayal, it's very on the nose, and for many it feels like she is acting irrationally in order to drive forward the story, which is kind of seen as lazy writing for some. Now, this is a problem that likely doesn't exist for the people who read Before the Storm, but that's not going to be most players. And then over on the Alliance side, Anduin seems to be a very well-received character, which kind of feeds back into the Alliance versus Horde narrative and that big drama debate discussion that's going on. And, with that said though, there is something a lot more important. What the hell is a WoW character anyway? Because if you take the in-game representation of WoW characters, they're almost all completely paper thin. Why? It's an MMO. Telling a story is really hard in an MMO, and you've got to think about how little screen time the main characters get. It's kind of a wonder Blizzard get any of it to work at all. Now, the result of this is that the version of most characters that exists in people's head is a mix of two things. First, it's the in-game character, and then second, it's how the player projects that character and perceives them. Now, what happens when you have characters who are thematically quite strong but are not really fleshed out in their details, what happens there is people do the legwork themselves. This means that Blizzard's more character-driven narrative runs the risk of not matching up with the vision that players have of the characters in their heads, which ultimately is a symptom of Blizzard poorly defining their characters in-game. Alright, next up, shock factor. This one's dead simple. Blizzard have seen Game of Thrones, they've seen a lot of popular modern storytelling. It's shock factor, it works. And it gets people talking, which ultimately is what they want, an emotionally engaged player base. Many of the actions that we see, and indeed the actions that Blizzard flat out advertise, they're particularly shocking and extreme. We've got a genocide here, a big plaguey thing here. In many ways, this expansion being a little bit more controversial and a bit more talked about than normal, it's all playing into Blizzard's plan. They wanted to take up as much headspace as it can, and they seem to be doing a good job of that, even if they take a little bit of a battering in terms of some criticism along the way. And next, it challenges Warcraft. For most of its life, Warcraft, or World of Warcraft, has been working off the established RTS lore. Blizzard have burned through all of that, and Battle for Azeroth is the first time, bar perhaps MoP, where Blizzard are carving a new path forward. This is going to challenge players' notions of what Warcraft is. Doing this is necessary for the long-term viability of the game, but they run the risk of losing players in the transition, and it really is as simple as that. Next, modern internet. The internet is more internet than ever. Everything is just a little bit more extreme and spicy, and the amount of social point scoring that's done on platforms like Twitter, all that's rising. Discourse is messy, and that's the environment that Blizzard have released their most shocking expansion ever into. And why do I say shocking? Well, as I said at the start of this video, Blizzard are pushing their marketing towards the extreme aspects of this expansion. Things like Teldrassil and Undercity. Even though most of the time you're still running around collecting bear arses in the woods, right? It's not all that different from what we're used to. And that's really all that we have. That's pretty much why I think this has been such a dramatic time. And really, as you can see, Blizzard's baiting of the Alliance and the Horde stuff, that's been deeply engraved in this expansion, even in the marketing of this expansion. And you can cut through a lot of that and get the nuance by checking out Before the Storm on today's sponsor for free, audible.com. Before the Storm is going to give you the first-person perspective of characters like Anduin and Sylvanas, and that's going to go a long way to making sense of their actions from the perspective of your in-game World of Warcraft character. Signing up will get you a free audiobook of your choice for life, even if you cancel. They're legit just giving you a free book and hoping that you like it enough to stick around. They have also got much of the more recent WoW catalog as well, if you've already got a copy of Before the Storm coming, or if it's not available in your region. So, with that, thank you very much for watching, and I would love to hear what is your read on the BFA situation. Does it feel like the dramas are a little bit divorced from reality more so than normal, or is Blizzard really just making big moves here that are bold and almost are guaranteed to leave some players behind? I'd love to hear what you think. But that's it for me. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.